Hey everyone, welcome to part 67 of my Pokemon game series in Unity. So in this video, we'll create story items. So story items can be used to take the story forward by using dialogues and cutscenes. So we haven't implemented cutscenes yet. So for now, we'll use story items to trigger dialogues. So let me show you how it works. So if I try to go out of the scene, you can see that it shows a dialogue saying it's not safe to go out there without a Pokemon. So basically we have a triggerable object in these two tiles that is triggering a dialog. So story items will be pretty useful when we start implementing our quest system. So let's look at how to implement them. Special thanks to all my Patreons for making this series possible. By becoming a Patreon, you can support me and get access to the complete project files of the series. The project files also contain some advanced features that are not covered on YouTube. So let's start the video. So first, I'll go to the hometown scene, and here I'll create a new game object called story item. All right. So let me reset its position and I'll place it over here. Okay. So next I'll add a box collider to it. Okay, so let me add a box collider 2D and I'll change its X size to 2 since we want to cover two tiles. So now let me just reposition it to the exact center. Okay. So next I'll create a script for the story item. So in scripts inside the gameplay folder, I'll create a new script called story item. All right. So let me get rid of all the default code. So the story item will be a player triggerable object, right? So when the player steps on it, it should trigger an action like dialogue or cutscene. So I'll make this class implement the iPlayer triggerable interface. And if we implement that, then we should also implement the onPlayer triggered function. Okay. So let me implement that also. So inside this function, I'll just write a debug log to test if this is working. So if you don't remember how the player triggerable system was implemented, I'll link the video in which it was implemented in the cards. Okay. So basically we use the same triggerable system for implementing other objects like long grass and portals and all. Okay. So we'll implement the story item in the same way. So in order for this to work, we need to add the story item to a layer and we need to mark that layer as a triggerable layer, right? So I'll create a new layer called triggers. Okay. In the future, we can put all the triggerable objects in this layer instead of having a separate layer for each one of them. Okay. So let me set the layer of the story item to triggers, and to this object I'll add the story item script that we just created. So next we need to assign this layer in our game layers script. So let me open up the game layer script. So here we have a reference to all the layers in the game. So let me add a variable for the triggers layer. Okay. And then I'll make sure to return it in the triggerable layers property. Okay. So now let's go to Unity and assign the triggers layer in the game layer script. So game layers is in the essential objects. So let me open the essential objects prefab, and we have game layers in the game controller object. So here I'll assign the triggers layer, and now the story item should be triggered when the player walks on top of it. Okay, so let's test it. All right. So here you can see it's printing the story item is working. So that means the onPlayer triggered function is being called. So next, instead of just printing this, we want to show a dialog, right? So first I'll create a variable to store the dialog. All right. And now inside the onPlayer triggered function, we can call dialog manager dot instance dot show dialog to show our dialog. Okay. So since this is coroutine, I'll put it inside start coroutine function. All right. So let's go to Unity and assign a dialog to the story item. Okay. So I'll say something like it's not safe to go out there without a Pokemon. All right. So let's go and test this. Okay. So the dialog's working, but the player is still animating, right? So when this happens, we also need the player to stop animating. So if you look at the implementation of long grass or portal, you can see that we are setting is moving to false to stop the player from animating. So I'll do the same from story item also. Okay, so let's test now. I'll just restart the game. All right. So now it's not animating and it's showing the dialogue when the player steps on it. Okay. So next, there is one issue that we need to fix. So if I'm standing on a story item and then if I move to this tile, you can see that it shows the dialogue again, right? But we don't want that. If the player is already on a story item, then we should not trigger it again if the player moves to another tile with the same story item. Okay, so for story items, we don't want to trigger them repeatedly, but for some triggerable objects, we do want them to trigger repeatedly, right? For example, for long grass, we want to keep triggering when the player moves over the same trigger, right? So let's look at how to handle that. So what I'll do is in the iPlayer triggerable interface, I'll create a new property called trigger repeatedly. Okay. So when we create a property like this inside an interface, we'll have to implement that property in all the classes that implement the interface, right? So here in long grass and portal and story item, you can see that we are having an error because we are not implementing the trigger repeatedly property, right? So let's go ahead and implement that in all the classes. So I'll implement it in the story item first. Okay. So let me just move this below the onPlayer triggered function. And in the case of story item, we don't want to trigger repeatedly, right? So I'll return false. Okay. So next, for the long grass, we do want it to trigger repeatedly. So I'll return true for this. Okay. So next, for the portal, we don't really want it to trigger repeatedly. So I'll set it to false. By the way, even if it was true, it wouldn't be a problem because as soon as we step on the portal, we'll block the player from moving and we'll switch the scene, right? So it doesn't really matter, but I'll just set it to false. Okay. So next we have two other classes that implement the player triggerable interface. So we have location portal. So here also I'll return false for the trigger repeatedly property. And finally we have trainer FOV. All right. So here also I'll return false. Okay. So let me just close all the scripts that we don't need. And now we should check the value of this property to determine whether we should trigger it or not. Okay. So we are triggering this from the player controller, right? So in the player controller, inside the onMoveOver function, when the player moves to a new tile, we are creating an overlap circle there, and we are checking if there are any triggerable objects in that tile, right? So here, what we need to do is, if the player moved to a new tile which has the same triggerable object, and if that triggerable object has trigger repeatedly set to false, then we should not trigger this function again, right? So first, we need to keep track of the trigger in which the player is currently in. So for that, I'll create a variable called currently in trigger. And if we find a triggerable object on the tile, then I'll set currently in trigger to the triggerable object that we found. And when we find a triggerable, we should check if it is equal to the trigger that we are currently in, and its trigger repeatedly value is false, right? So if we moved over the same trigger and the trigger repeatedly set to false, then we don't want to trigger this function and we can just break, right? And finally, we also have to clear the currently in trigger variable when we go out of the current trigger, right? So at the end of this function, I'll check if colliders.count is equal to 0. So that means there isn't any triggerable object on that tile, right? So if the count is equal to 0, or if there is a triggerable object on the tile, but if it's not same as the current one, even then we can clear the currently in trigger variable. Okay. So I'll also check if the triggerable. Okay, so since the triggerable variable is defined inside the for loop, we don't have access to it out here. So I'll just define it above the for loop. Okay. I think I made a typo here. Let me just fix that. So yeah, now we can access the triggerable object outside the loop. And here I'll check if the triggerable object is not equal to the current one. Okay. So here we have an error because this variable might be unassigned if this loop doesn't run, right? So let me just set it to null by default. Okay, so if this is the case, then we can just clear the currently in trigger variable. All right, so let's go to Unity and test if this is working. So let me go step on the story item, and now if I move to this tile, you can see that it's not triggering again when we move over it. Okay, but if we come out and then go back, it'll trigger again. All right, so that's working correctly. The story item is not triggering repeatedly. But let's also go test the long grass. So in the case of long grass, it should trigger repeatedly, and it is actually triggering, but we are having this error because we are not testing it from the gameplay scene. We are just testing the individual scene, right? So let's go to the gameplay scene and test that to make sure we don't have any issues. Okay, so if I walk over the long grass, it should keep triggering repeatedly. Okay, so let's test that. So yeah, it's working, right? But if we step on the story item, you can see that it'll only trigger once, and it won't trigger unless you come out and walk on it again. Okay, so I'll stop the video here, and in the next video we'll start working on our quest system. So we'll use the story item to block the player from moving out of the scene, and we'll let the player go once he completes a quest. Okay, so before you leave, please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing to my channel. That'll really help me out. So I'll see you in the next video.